The air in Vienna, Virginia, on the evening of the 18th of February 2001, was biting, carrying a chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the suburbs. At Folkestone Park, a modest stretch of greenery nestled near the upscale homes of intelligence officials, the silence was absolute, save for the distant hum of traffic. A silver Ford Taurus came to a controlled halt near the park entrance, its headlights cutting through the darkness before flickering out into nothingness. From the driver's side stepped a man who looked like any other middle-aged bureaucrat heading home after a long day at the office. He was dressed in a dark overcoat, his posture slightly stooped, his face a mask of practiced, suburban anonymity that concealed a double life. Robert Philip Hanssen moved with a calculated purpose that suggested he had walked this specific path 1,000 times in his mind before tonight. He carried a plastic garbage bag, weighted down with items that possessed the power to dismantle the national security of the United States. To any casual observer, he was merely a man disposing of household waste, perhaps an eccentric neighbor taking an evening stroll in the freezing cold. But hidden within that mundane plastic bag were top-secret documents and a computer disk containing encrypted data destined for the hands of Russian intelligence. This was the ritual of the dead drop, a silent, ghostly exchange that had remained undetected for over 2 decades. He approached a wooden footbridge, a landmark he had designated in his communications with his handlers, under the operational alias Ramon Garcia. Underneath the bridge, a pre-arranged spot awaited his delivery, a location where no words would be spoken and no faces would be seen. Hanssen knelt, his movements stiff but precise, wedging the package into its hiding place with the muscle memory of a professional. For 22 years, this invisibility had been his greatest weapon, allowing him to operate within the heart of the FBI while selling its soul. He believed he was the smartest man in any room, a shadow that the light of the law could never hope to reach. As he stood up and turned to retreat toward his vehicle, the artificial stillness of the park was shattered by a sudden, blinding eruption of light. From the surrounding thickets and the shadows of the trees, black-clad figures materialized like ghosts given solid form, their movements synchronized and overwhelming. The heavy thud of tactical boots hit the frozen earth as members of the FBI tactical squad swarmed the area with weapons drawn. The air was filled with the sharp, authoritative shouts of federal agents who had spent months preparing for this exact second of confrontation. The man who had eluded capture for a generation was suddenly pinned against the cold metal of his own car. Hanssen did not fight, nor did he attempt to flee, for he knew better than anyone that the perimeter was sealed tight. Instead, he uttered a sentence that perfectly captured the chilling arrogance and professional detachment he had maintained since 1979. He looked at the agents who were handcuffing him and asked with a voice devoid of emotion, "What took you so long?" It was not a plea for mercy, but a final, cynical jab at the agency he had betrayed, a recognition that the game was over. The master spy, the man who had crippled American intelligence from the inside, was finally stripped of his cover in the glare of flashlights. As the plastic bag was recovered from beneath the bridge, the magnitude of the moment began to settle upon the agents involved. This was not just the arrest of a rogue employee, but the culmination of the most damaging counterintelligence failure in the history of the country. Within hours, the news would reach the highest levels of the White House, triggering a wave of shock that would forever change the FBI. The myth of Robert Hanssen as the loyal, devout, and boring counterintelligence expert was dead, replaced by the reality of a cold-blooded traitor. The fox had been caught in his own park, and the investigation into how he survived so long was only beginning. To understand the man pinned against the car in Folkestone Park, one must look back at the gray, rigid corridors of his early life. Robert Hanssen was born in Chicago in 1944, growing up under the shadow of a father who was a police officer and an emotional tyrant. Howard Hanssen was a man who frequently belittled his son, constantly questioning his worth and demanding a standard of perfection that was impossible to achieve. This volatile domestic environment forged a young man who was deeply introverted, socially awkward, and possessed a desperate need to prove his intellectual superiority. He learned early on that information was a form of protection, a secret currency that could be hoarded and used to navigate a hostile world. After a brief and unremarkable stint as a police officer in Chicago, Hanssen joined the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1976, seeking the structure he craved. He was quickly assigned to the field of counterintelligence, a world of shadows where his natural penchant for secrecy and his analytical mind were seen as assets. However, beneath the surface of the quiet, suit-wearing agent, A profound sense of professional resentment began to take root and grow. Hanssen felt that his colleagues were inferior, lacking his technical precision and his deep understanding of the Soviet threat that loomed over the Cold War era. He saw himself as a grandmaster playing chess against amateurs, yet he remained stuck in the middle ranks of the bureaucracy. The transition from a loyal servant of the law to a high-level traitor happened with a chilling, clinical detachment in the year 1979. There was no grand political awakening, no sudden love for the communist cause or the Soviet Union's crumbling social architecture. Instead, Hanssen's motivation was a toxic cocktail of financial pressure and the ego-driven thrill of being a double agent. He walked into a library, researched the addresses of Soviet trade officials, and sent a letter to the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Agency. In that single, calculated act, he offered up the name of one of the FBI's most valuable Soviet sources in exchange for a briefcase full of cash. This first betrayal was a test of the system he knew so well, a way to see if the FBI could catch a ghost. When no one came knocking on his door, Hanssen felt a surge of adrenaline that no mundane desk job could ever provide. He discovered that he possessed a terrifying talent for deception, moving through the office by day as a devout Catholic and family man. He was a member of Opus Dei, a conservative religious organization, and he frequently lectured his fellow agents on the importance of traditional values and morality. This pious exterior was the perfect camouflage, a shield that made him seem beyond suspicion to those who worked alongside him every single day. As the 1980s progressed, Hanssen's double life became more complex, and his demands for compensation grew alongside his risks. He was not just selling secrets, he was selling the very lives of people who had risked everything to help the United States. He knew the names of every double agent, the location of every bugging device, and the technical specifications of America's most sensitive nuclear programs. Yet, he never allowed himself to be seduced by the lifestyle of a wealthy man, hiding his blood money in offshore accounts and secret stashes. He continued to drive an old car and live in a modest house, finding his satisfaction in the secret knowledge that he was the most dangerous man in the room. The psychological profile of Hanssen reveals a man who viewed the world as a complex machine with flaws that only he could exploit. He took a dark pleasure in identifying the vulnerabilities of the FBI's security protocols, treating the betrayal of his country like a high-stakes technical problem. He was a ghost in the machine, a man who had mastered the art of being forgettable while committing the most memorable crimes in the history of espionage. His motive was never about the money alone, but about the power that came from holding the life of a nation in his hands. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed, Hanssen had already become the most successful mole in the history of the intelligence community. As the 1980s transitioned into the final act of the Cold War, Robert Hanssen refined his espionage into a masterclass of clinical efficiency. Operating under the alias Ramon Garcia, he established a set of protocols that were so rigorous they practically eliminated the risk of detection. Unlike other spies who were often caught through face-to-face meetings or flamboyant spending, Hanssen insisted on total anonymity. He refused to meet his Soviet handlers in person, communicating solely through encrypted letters and dead drops in public parks. This no-contact rule created a black hole for investigators. Even if the Soviets had a mole in their own ranks, that mole could not identify Hanssen because the Russians themselves didn't know his true name. Hanssen's deep understanding of the FBI's internal security allowed him to navigate the Bureau's database like a predator in a familiar forest. He was a pioneer in using the agency's own technology against it, often logging into the automated case support system to see if there were any active investigations into a mysterious Ramon Garcia. If he saw his own shadow getting too close to the light, he simply retreated and waited. He was a master of the long game, sometimes going dark for years when he sensed the counterintelligence climate was too warm. This patience was his greatest shield, making him appear as nothing more than a dedicated, if somewhat dour, civil servant to his unsuspecting colleagues. The information Hanssen provided was not merely tactical, it was existential, striking at the very foundation of American national security. He handed over the Coins 2 document, a comprehensive guide to how the United States intercepted Soviet satellite communications, effectively blinding American ears. Even more devastating was his disclosure of the continuity of government plans, which outlined how the U.S. would respond to a nuclear strike. Hanssen was essentially giving the Kremlin the keys to the American kingdom, showing them exactly where the holes were in the nuclear umbrella. To the KGB, Hanssen was the most valuable asset they had ever possessed, a fountain of gold that never seemed to run dry. Perhaps the most cold-blooded aspect of his master plan was the casual way he traded human lives for bundles of used $100 bills. In 1985, a year known in the intelligence community as the Year of the Spy, Hanssen identified 3 Soviet agents who were secretly working for the FBI. These men, including General Dmitry Polyakov, were the crown jewels of American intelligence inside the Soviet military. Because of Hanssen's tip-off, they were arrested, interrogated, and eventually executed by a firing squad in the basement of Lubyanka prison. Hanssen knew exactly what their fate would be when he typed their names into his letters, yet he felt no flicker of remorse. To keep the Russians interested and the money flowing, Hanssen also revealed one of the most expensive and secretive projects in FBI history. The tunnel under the Soviet embassy, the U.S., had spent hundreds of millions of dollars digging a sophisticated listening post directly beneath the Russian diplomatic mission in Washington, D.C. Hanssen informed his handlers of the project before it was even fully operational, allowing the Soviets to use the tunnel as a conduit for dangle information. They fed the FBI useless or misleading data for years, laughing at the Americans who thought they were eavesdropping on the Kremlin's deepest secrets. Hanssen sat in his office, watching his own agency waste millions, fueled by a secret, twisted sense of triumph. The brilliance of his execution lay in his ability to compartmentalize his life into 2 impenetrable spheres. In one world, he was the gray man, a devout father of 6 who attended daily mass and criticized the moral decay of modern society. In the other, he was a high-stakes gambler with the lives of nations, accumulating a fortune in diamonds and cash hidden in suburban crawl spaces. He used the very techniques he was supposed to use to catch spies to ensure he would never be caught himself. He wasn't just a mole. He was the architect of a silent war. A man who had turned the entire machinery of the FBI into a tool for his own ego and bank account. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 should have been the end of the line for a Cold War mole, but Robert Hanssen was an adaptable predator. He simply waited for the dust to settle before offering his services to the new Russian Federation. However, the American intelligence community was finally waking up to a terrifying reality. There was a ghost in the system. For years, the FBI had been chasing shadows, at one point even wrongly accusing a different agent, Brian Kelly, whose life was nearly destroyed by the suspicion. The real mole, meanwhile, sat in his office, likely mocking the incompetence of the hunters from behind his computer screen. The turning point came not from a brilliant piece of detective work by the FBI, but from a high-stakes transaction in the dark world of international espionage. In 2000, the FBI and CIA managed to pay a massive sum, reportedly $7 million, to a former Russian intelligence officer who had access to the SVR's most sensitive files. Among these documents was a trash bag containing a package that Ramon Garcia had once delivered. The bag was a treasure trove of forensic evidence, but the most damning piece was a recorded telephone conversation between the spy and his handlers. When FBI investigators played the tape, the room went silent. They didn't need a voice analyst. They recognized the voice instantly. It was the low, monotone drawl of Robert Hanssen. The FBI's reaction was a mixture of horror and cold calculation. They couldn't simply arrest him. They needed to catch him in the act to ensure a conviction that would hold up under the weight of his 22-year betrayal. To do this, they orchestrated an elaborate sting operation. They promoted Hanssen to a new, specially created position at the FBI headquarters, supposedly to oversee a high-level task force. In reality, the office was a high-tech trap, rigged with hidden cameras and microphones. To keep a constant eye on him, the Bureau assigned a young, ambitious agent named Eric O'Neill to work as Hanssen's administrative assistant, with the secret mission of monitoring every keystroke and every movement the veteran spy made. O'Neill found himself in a psychological pressure cooker, working for a man who was notoriously difficult, arrogant, and highly suspicious. Hanssen was a paranoid master of counterintelligence, and he frequently tested the young agent, trying to see if O'Neill was hiding anything. The tension escalated when Hanssen began to suspect that his computer was being accessed remotely. The game of cat and mouse reached its peak in February 2001. O'Neill managed to snatch Hanssen's encrypted Palm Pilot from his jacket pocket during a brief moment of distraction, rushing it to a technical team to be cloned before Hanssen returned from the bathroom. This bold move provided the final proof, a schedule for an upcoming dead drop. As the date of the drop approached, the FBI moved hundreds of agents into position around Foxstone Park. The atmosphere within the bureau was electric, with a sense of impending justice and profound betrayal. They watched as Hanssen, ever the creature of habit, prepared for his final mission. He was so confident in his own brilliance, so sure that he was untouchable, that he failed to notice the subtle signs of the net closing around him. He didn't realize that the assistant he bullied was actually his jailer, or that the quiet park he chose for his drops had been turned into a massive stage for his public downfall. The climax was not a Hollywood shootout, but a clinical extraction. When Hanssen walked into the park on that frozen February evening, he was walking into a trap he had unintentionally helped build through his own arrogance. He had ignored the cardinal rule of espionage: never assume you are the only one watching. As the tactical teams converged, the mastermind was finally forced to face the reality that he had been outmaneuvered. The man who had spent a lifetime exploiting the flaws of others had finally succumbed to the greatest flaw of all: his own narcissism. The net had finally closed, and the silence of his double life was about to be replaced by the roar of a national scandal. The fallout from the arrest of Robert Hanssen sent shockwaves through the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., reaching the highest levels of the Pentagon and the White House. The realization that a senior FBI agent had been a Russian mole for over 2 decades forced a painful and public reckoning for the entire American intelligence community. Investigators quickly discovered that Hanssen's betrayal was not a simple case of a few leaked documents, but a systemic hemorrhaging of national secrets that had compromised hundreds of operations. The sheer volume of material he had surrendered, over 6,000 pages of classified data and dozens of computer disks, was staggering, leading experts to label it the most costly intelligence disaster in United States history. In the wake of his capture, Hanssen faced a stark reality. The very legal system he had once served was now prepared to seek the ultimate penalty for his treason. Prosecutors built a massive case against him, charging him with multiple counts of espionage and conspiracy, crimes that carried the possibility of the death penalty. To save his own life, the man who had shown no mercy to the agents he betrayed began to negotiate. In July 2001, Hanssen reached a plea agreement with the government, pleading guilty to 15 counts of espionage in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. As part of the deal, he was required to undergo months of intensive debriefing to explain exactly what he had given to the Russians. During these debriefing sessions, the psychological complexity of Robert Hanssen became even more apparent to the investigators who interviewed him. He remained cold, analytical, and often condescending, treating the process as a final lecture to students who were not quite on his level. He admitted that the thrill of the game and the financial rewards were his primary drivers, dismissing any notion of political loyalty to Russia. He had received over $4 million in cash and diamonds, yet he had lived a life of drab, suburban mediocrity, hiding his wealth like a squirrel, burying nuts for a winter that never came. His double life was a monument to a fractured psyche, a man who sought validation through the secret destruction of the world he inhabited. On the 10th of May 2002, the final gavel fell. Robert Hanssen was sentenced to remain behind bars for the rest of his natural life, with no chance of ever seeing the sun as a free man again. He was sent to ADX Florence, the Supermax prison in Colorado, a facility designed for the most dangerous criminals in the federal system. There, he was held in near total isolation, confined to a small concrete cell for 23 hours a day. The man who had spent his life navigating the vast, interconnected world of global secrets was suddenly reduced to a world that was only 7 by 12 feet wide. It was a sterile, silent end for a man who had thrived on the noise of covert warfare. Hanssen remained in that silent tomb for over 20 years, becoming a ghost of a bygone era as the world moved on into the digital age of cyber warfare. His legacy, however, lived on in the form of drastically tightened security protocols within the FBI and CIA. The Hanssen effect, led to mandatory polygraph tests for agents, more rigorous financial monitoring, and a complete overhaul of how internal databases are accessed. He had proven that the greatest threat to a fortress is often the person holding the keys to the gate. On the 5th of June 2023, prison staff found the 79-year-old Hanssen unresponsive in his cell. He had died of natural causes, taking any remaining secrets with him to the grave. The story of Robert Hanssen remains a chilling case study in the anatomy of betrayal and the limits of institutional trust. He was a man who possessed every tool of the trade but lacked the one thing that defines a true guardian: integrity. In the end, Ramon Garcia was not the brilliant mastermind he believed himself to be, but a tragic figure who traded the lives of his colleagues and the safety of his nation for a briefcase of cash and a sense of hollow superiority. As the files on his case are archived and the names of his victims fade into history, the name Robert Hanssen stands as a permanent warning that the most dangerous enemy is the one who sits in the office next to yours.